Solomon Louis lifted the telephone receiver to his mouth. He spoke Choctaw, the language his nation had been forbidden to use. On the Western Front's deadliest ground, his tribal code became America's secret weapon. One Choctaw soldier, one field telephone, one order that had to get through. You have heard of Navajo Code Talkers. This happened 24 years before them. 24 years before. Most people have never heard the name Solomon Louis. That is not an accident. That is a choice history made. And this is the story of what that choice cost. Solomon Louis was a young man from Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. He was Choctaw, a citizen of the Choctaw Nation, one of the oldest nations on this continent. When he was born, the memory of the Trail of Tears was not history. It was what his grandparents carried in their bodies. Beginning in 1830, the United States government forced the Choctaw people from their Mississippi homelands. They walked west to Oklahoma under military escort. In winter, without enough food, thousands died on that march. The ones who survived rebuilt their nation in a place they had not chosen. That place was Indian Territory. That is where Solomon Louis grew up. By the time he was a young man, the United States had done something else to his nation. The Dawes Act had dissolved tribal governments and broken communal lands into individual allotments. Federal boarding school policy was targeting the Choctaw language itself. Children were being punished, physically punished, for speaking the words their parents spoke at home. The policy had one stated goal: eliminate the language, eliminate the culture, make the Indian disappear. And then the war came. In 1917, the United States entered the First World War. Approximately 14,000 American Indian men enlisted or were drafted. 14,000, roughly the entire current population of Tahlequah, Oklahoma, going to war at once. They went to war for a country that did not legally recognize them as citizens. The Indian Citizenship Act would not be signed until 1924, 6 years after the armistice, 6 years after these men had bled. Solomon Louis enlisted anyway. He was assigned to the 142nd Infantry Regiment, 36th Division. The 36th was called the Panther Division, a Texas-Oklahoma National Guard unit. Because it drew from Oklahoma, it included Choctaw men from Indian Territory. That geographic accident would change the war. By the fall of 1918, the Allied push was entering its final and deadliest phase. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, one of the bloodiest campaigns in American military history. Approximately 26,000 Americans would die in that offensive. 26,000. Every name a family somewhere kept saying long after the flags came down. The 36th Division was operating in the Saint-Étienne sector, northeastern France, and they had a problem that was killing soldiers faster than bullets. German forces had become extraordinarily skilled at intercepting Allied telephone communications. Orders transmitted in English were being intercepted and decoded within minutes. Attacks were failing before they began. Men were walking into ambushes built from their own orders. The line was compromised. It had been for weeks. Military command was desperate for a solution that no cryptographer could crack. The solution was not a machine. It was not a codebook. It was a living language that only a sovereign people carried. According to the account that would later reach Colonel A.W. Bloor, a commanding officer first heard Choctaw soldiers speaking among themselves. He asked what language that was. They told him, Choctaw. He made a decision that would not be officially documented for 3 more months. He put Choctaw soldiers on the telephones. The shelling had not stopped for days. Mud and cordite, the smell of wet wool and something burning that had no name. The noise of the Meuse-Argonne was not loud the way a single explosion is loud. It was the kind of noise that enters the body and does not leave. Into that noise, on October 26, 1918, Corporal Solomon Louis picked up a field telephone. He spoke in Choctaw, the language his grandparents had carried out of Mississippi on foot, the language children in federal schools were being beaten for speaking at that very moment back home. He spoke it into a wire stretched across the broken earth of northeastern France. And the order passed, clearly, instantly, unbroken. The enemy heard it. They could not read it. No German interceptor in 1918 had ever encountered the Choctaw language. There was no cipher to reverse engineer, because it was not a cipher. It was a language of living people. It could not be decoded by anyone who did not belong to it. Over the following days, at least 8 Choctaw soldiers served as telephone communicators for the 36th Division. German interception of orders dropped sharply in their sector. Attacks that had been failing began to succeed. The men transmitting those orders were Solomon Lewis, Mitchell Bob, Calvin Wilson, James Edwards, Noel Johnson, George Davenport, Pete Maytubby, and others. Their names are in the records. Most people have never read them. Solomon Lewis, Mitchell Bob, Calvin Wilson, James Edwards. On January 23, 1919, Colonel A.W. Bloor filed a formal written report. In it, he identified the Choctaw language telephone transmissions as operationally effective. He wrote, in his own words, "The results were very gratifying. Very gratifying. A colonel's understatement for, it worked. Men lived who would otherwise have died." That report is in the National Archives, Record Group 120. It has been there since 1919. For most of a century, almost no one looked at it. But what came next, nobody teaches this. The armistice was signed November 11, 1918. Solomon Louis and the surviving Choctaw soldiers began the journey home. Home was Oklahoma, the same Oklahoma where their nation had been resettled under federal compulsion less than 90 years before. These soldiers had transmitted the orders that helped end a world war. They came home to a state operating under Jim Crow racial segregation. Water fountains labeled, waiting rooms divided, schools separated. The ballot box, the one thing a citizen can hold, was not accessible to them because they were not yet citizens. Solomon Lewis was a veteran of the United States Army. He was not yet a citizen of the United States. Read that again. Let it land. He had transmitted battlefield orders in a language the government was punishing children for speaking. He came home to a country that would not formally recognize his citizenship for 6 more years. No parade for Solomon Louis, no medal, no headline. The men who had just broken German communications returned to a nation that had not changed the signs. Consider what that meant. A Tuesday morning in 1919, concrete and actual. You step off a train in Oklahoma. You are in uniform. You did something that no one in the history of this continent had done before. And the sign on the water fountain does not care. And the voting registrar does not care. And the government that took your nation's land, dissolved your tribal government, targeted your language. That government files Colonel Bloor's report and moves on. No public ceremony, no recognition, nothing. There is a specific cruelty in that silence worth sitting with. The United States government had spent decades trying to eliminate the Choctaw language. Federal boarding schools operated on one principle: the language must go. Children were separated from families, forbidden to speak Choctaw, punished when they did. The policy was not subtle. It was written down. It was funded. It was enforced. And then, in the fall of 1918, the Army needed that language to save American lives. Here is the image that makes this undeniable. Imagine a country banning Spanish in every school, punishing children for speaking it, and then, in a military emergency, calling those same children and saying, "We need you to speak Spanish right now. Lives depend on it." That is exactly what the United States did with the Choctaw language in 1918. The children being beaten for speaking Choctaw, and the soldiers being asked to speak Choctaw. They were the same generation. Solomon Lewis may have known children who were punished for the very words he was now transmitting as a military asset. There is no verified quote from Solomon Louis in the public historical record about how that felt. No diary found, no letter confirmed. History did not think to ask him while he was alive. What we have instead is silence where his voice should be. And that silence is also the story. His fellow Choctaw soldier, Joseph Oklahomby, had separately distinguished himself in the same campaign. Oklahomby, fighting in the same Meuse-Argonne push, had captured approximately 171 German prisoners. He had destroyed a machine gun nest under fire. France recognized this. France awarded him the Croix de Guerre, one of its highest military honors. The United States did not offer comparable recognition for decades. France decorated a Choctaw soldier. America did not. This is not a footnote. It is a pattern. The men who had served at the highest personal cost, without citizenship, without guarantee of recognition, came home to a country that looked away. The 1920s passed. The Indian Citizenship Act was finally signed in 1924, a document that should have preceded their service, not followed it by 6 years. The 1930s passed. The Great Depression hit Indian Territory hard. The 1940s brought a new war and a new generation of native code talkers. The Navajo Code Talker program began in 1942, 24 years after Solomon Louis made his first transmission. The Navajo program was formally classified until 1968, which partly explains why it became better known. But the secrecy of the Navajo program does not explain why the Choctaw story was never told. The Choctaw program was never classified. Colonel Bloor's report was available in the National Archives. The story was there. The record was there. The names were there. And here is where the evidence gets harder to ignore. The national narrative, the one taught in schools, repeated in documentaries, cited in museums, credits World War II as the origin of native military linguistics. 1942. The Navajo Code Talkers. The beginning of the story. But the story began in 1918, with Choctaw men, with Solomon Louis. The 24-year gap between those two programs is not a footnote. It is the story. It is the whole story. Because what that gap represents is a choice. A sustained, decades-long choice. To let one story stand for both. To let one nation's sacrifice become visible while another's became invisible. The Choctaw Nation had already survived the Trail of Tears. They had survived the Dawes Act and the dissolution of their tribal government. They had survived the boarding school assault on their language. And after 1918, they survived erasure from the story of their own service. Survive. That word belongs to them. William C. Meadows, in his 2002 scholarly work on World War I native code talkers, documented the Choctaw program comprehensively. His research, drawing on the National Archives and Choctaw Nation records, is the most complete account available. But a 2002 academic text does not reach most Americans. Most Americans will live their entire lives not knowing the name Solomon Louis, not knowing that the first battlefield order ever transmitted in a native language as a military communications tool was spoken by a Choctaw man on October 26, 1918, in the mud and smoke of northeastern France, into a wire, the language of his grandparents, the language of the Trail of Tears, spoken into the machinery of a war fought by men who were not yet citizens of the country they were fighting for. But the most revealing part of this story is still ahead. For decades after the armistice, the Choctaw Code Talkers existed primarily in tribal memory. The Choctaw Nation did not forget. Families passed the story down, but the official record gathered dust. It was not until 1986, 68 years after the St. Etienne transmissions, that anything changed. Oklahoma Governor George Nye issued a formal state proclamation honoring the Choctaw Code Talkers. 68 years. A child born the year Solomon Louis transmitted that order would have been 68 years old. And the first recognition was a state proclamation, not a federal medal, not a ceremony in Washington. A state proclamation. Then the years continued. In 2008, Congress passed the Code Talkers Recognition Act, Public Law 110-420, authorizing Congressional Gold Medals for Choctaw and other World War I Code Talker groups. The Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors the United States government can award, 90 years after the service. Better late than never, except for what came next. Not one original Choctaw Code Talker was still alive. The ceremony was set for November 20, 2013, Washington, D.C., the capital. 95 years after Solomon Louis pressed that telephone to his ear in France, a child born on October 26, 1918, the exact day of that first transmission, would have been 95 years old, older than nearly any living American. The descendants of the Choctaw Code Talkers stood in the Capitol building to receive the medals. They held gold medals engraved with names they carried in their own blood. and every man who had earned those medals was gone. The medals are beautiful. The delay is the story. At that ceremony, Choctaw Nation Chief Gary Batten spoke. He said, "Our ancestors were asked to use the very language that the federal government was trying to eradicate through its boarding school policies. They answered that call with honor. They answered that call with honor. The federal government was trying to eradicate the Choctaw language, and the Choctaw men used that language under fire, without citizenship, without promise of recognition to answer the call. Not despite what had been done to them, alongside the full weight of what had been done to them. That is not assimilation. That is sovereign continuity. The Choctaw Nation survived removal. They survived allotment. They survived the boarding school assault. And in October of 1918, they used what had survived their language to defend a country that had not yet decided they were citizens. That act belongs to them. It is theirs. The country did not earn it. They gave it. That distinction matters. The Congressional Gold Medal now sits in cases held by the Choctaw Nation and the descendants of the original talkers. It is a real honor, arrived 95 years too late, to be held by the hands that earned it. Solomon Louis does not have a well-documented post-war biography in the public record. No memoir, no archive of letters, no oral history transcript entered into a database somewhere. His name appears in military records. It appears in tribal documentation. It appears in Meadows's research. And then history, for the most part, stops talking about him. That is what erasure looks like. Not a dramatic deletion, just silence, filling the space where a life should be documented. He transmitted orders that helped end a world war. His country did not think the details of his life worth preserving. What we know is this: he was Choctaw. He was a corporal in the 142nd Infantry. He was there. On October 26, 1918, he was there. The Choctaw language he spoke that day is now classified as endangered. Fluent first language speakers number in the hundreds. The Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma runs active language programs, teachers, recordings, curricula built to keep what remains from disappearing entirely. Children are learning words in classrooms today that their great-grandparents were punished for speaking. That is not a footnote to 1918. That is 1918, still moving. The soldiers who used that language as a tool in 1918 are part of why some people today fight to keep it alive. The war the Choctaw language survived was not only the one in France. It was the one the federal government had been waging against it for generations. In classrooms, in boarding schools, in policy documents with clean official letterhead, Solomon Louis spoke into that wire in 1918, carrying all of that. He could not have done otherwise. The language did not arrive clean and separated from its history. It arrived whole, with the trail of tears in it, with the boarding schools in it, with the grandparents who had carried it west on foot in winter. And it was that language, complete, unbroken, sovereign, that the German interceptors could not crack. They could not crack it, because it belonged to a people who refused to let it be destroyed. The next time someone tells the story of native military linguistics as beginning in 1942, say the name. October 26, 1918. Corporal Solomon Louis, the 142nd Infantry, the Choctaw Nation. He picked up a telephone and spoke in the language of his people. The order passed. The line held. The language held. If you want to understand what was done to the Choctaw Nation across 2 centuries and what the Choctaw Nation chose to do anyway, you do not need a long explanation. You need one image: a young man in a forward position, shelling in the distance, pressing a handset to his ear, speaking words the United States government had tried to silence, into a wire, for a country that had not yet decided he was a citizen, getting the order through. The Choctaw Nation survived the Trail of Tears. They survived the Dawes Act. They survived the boarding schools. They survived the silence that followed 1918. And they will tell you, if you ask, that the language is still here. Endangered? Yes. Reduced? Yes. But here, in the Choctaw Nation's language programs, in the children learning words their great-grandparents were punished for speaking, in the names that scholars like William Meadows had to fight to bring back into the record. Solomon Louis, Mitchell Bob, Calvin Wilson, James Edwards, Noel Johnson, George Davenport, Pete Maytubby, Joseph Oklahomby, Ben Carterby, Tobias Frazier, Walter Veach. Say the names. These men were Choctaw. They were soldiers. They were, in a precise and documentable sense, the first. The Congressional Gold Medal in Washington is real. The honor is real. And the 95 years it took is real, too. Both things are true. The nation carries both. History has a way of giving medals to the dead while ignoring the living. The Choctaw Code Talkers received a medal that none of them could hold. What they did hold for nearly a century before that ceremony was the story itself. In family memory, in tribal record, in the careful hands of a people who know what it means when a government looks away, they held it until the rest of us were ready to hear it. Read William Meadows's scholarship. Visit the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma's historical records. The next time you hear the story of Code Talkers begin in 1942, speak up. Not to diminish the Navajo Code Talkers, their sacrifice was real, their service was remarkable, and that story deserves every telling it gets. But to add what was removed? To give back what was taken. 24 years earlier, the Choctaw Nation, the Western Front, a language the United States tried to destroy, spoken into a field telephone in northeastern France. Getting the order through. The country that awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in 2013 is the same country that targeted the Choctaw language in 1918. That is not a contradiction to resolve. It is a tension to hold honestly, without looking away. Solomon Lewis did not look away from what his country was. He picked up the telephone anyway. The least we can do is learn his name. Learn his name. October 26, 1918. Corporal Solomon Louis, Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. The voice in the wire. The first.